In order to get a proper understanding of history, we first need to really understand who's teaching us this history that is taught to us in every single education system. If you do a quick Google search on famous historians, you'll find something very, very strange. You can see that there were historians about 2,000 years ago, and then we have to skip pretty much 1,700 years, roughly 1,800. However, I mean, it's a rough estimate, but you can see that there's just a massive gap, basically no historians and then a ton of historians. Now we can do the same thing for other fields. We could go to authors, we could go to playwrights, we could even go to science. And the thing about science is Charles Darwin is the one who has taught us pretty much everything that we teach in the current education systems. Now, if you don't know this about Charles Darwin, he was a Freemason. He was a Satanist. He was alive from 1809 to 1882. Photography was invented in the 1830s, not sure the exact date, but electricity discovered in 1879. All these things happening the same time period. So basically, we don't know any history from before 200 years ago. Now let's take a moment to discuss the ghost cities. You're probably very confused. What am I talking about with these ghost cities? Well, what you're about to see is going to be very shocking. During, I'd say, sometime around 1850, give or take a few years, you can just look at various cities across the world, and there's just so many cities that were just completely vacant. It's like either the people who used to live there were emptied out, or these cities were just built and they were ready to have a population move in. It's very, 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 very strange. Okay, so now we can dive into some photos of Moscow, Russia. The year is 1867. So just like I said, it's right around 1850 is when we think something may have occurred. So you can see from these photos that this is a massive city. And where are the people? There are no people in these pictures. How do you take pictures of an entire city and not see any people outside? Who lives here? Does anybody live here? In a couple pictures we might see like one or two people, but that's not what cities look like. Cities are full. Cities have many, many people walking everywhere. Alright, now we can look at some photos of San Francisco. This is roughly around 1870, somewhere between 1860 to 1880 is where we could expect most of these pictures were taken. Now this San Francisco does not quite look like the San Francisco that we know today. It actually looks better. How was the architecture able to be better when the technology they apparently had was just these horses and whatever? But we can look at these devices here, possibly some form of electricity. Not really sure what was going on. Maybe these cathedrals were not cathedrals at all. Maybe, just maybe, there were some form of power plants. Alright, now we can talk about this beautiful city called Toronto, which also happens to have barely anybody living in it in the same time period. Do we have any ideas why? Well, we're going to talk about the possible theories behind why that may be. Now, the most popular theory for this is the Mudflood theory. So, without further ado, let's get into the Mudflood theory. So at first glance, this picture might not seem weird at all, but if you really look at it, you can see that the door is not actually on the first floor, and it appears that the first floor has been like halfway covered up by the rise of mud or the sinking of the buildings. But you can look, it's on all the buildings, and then they had to build stairs and then a new door on the second floor to make that the main entrance and the main floor now. In this picture, you can see that there actually was mud there, and it seems that somebody cleared the mud out, and you can see that they did in fact have a door below and they had to build a new door. And the strangest part is that we can see this in pretty much all across the world around the same time period. Just the cities got flooded, and who knows, the land rose. Don't know the cause, but something is going on. Alright, so now let's talk about ancient Egypt a little bit. Ancient Egypt. Very, very mysterious place. I think we can all agree. The pyramids, most people are just very confused. Right here is a mummy. Now this mummy does not look quite as old as ancient Egypt to me. I'm not sure how they could possibly preserve a body that well. Like the skin still looks kind of shiny. Like how is that possible? Now this is a picture from Rome. Apparently Rome has pyramids, or a pyramid anyway. Egyptian influence, possibly. Now here's an obelisk. If you actually look at it, you can see there's even hieroglyphics on it. How are there hieroglyphics in Rome? Another one. You can even see the hieroglyphics a little bit better here. And I think we have one more picture. Indeed we do. That might be the same one as the first one, I'm not entirely sure. But yeah, some pictures of Rome, what's going on, Egypt and Rome connected. And now we also got cocaine found and nicotine found in the mummy. Now, these drugs were only in the New World, as they call it, in the Americas. I believe South America specifically is where it comes from. So just how? That is the only question, really. Okay, so in this section, we can talk about technology. This section is probably going to be a little bit longer than the others, to be honest. I'm not really sure. Just kind of winging this video, but, you know, do my best I can, really. So first, let me just read a few things because, you know, I don't have a perfect memory and this is worded pretty well. So first, let's talk about rockets. So if you're familiar with the Star-Spangled Banner, you know that it talks about bombs bursting in air, the red rocket glare. This was written in 1814, people. 1814. What rockets could they be talking about that are bursting in the air? If you've ever watched a movie from any of these time periods, like a movie about these time periods, they'll show cannons, they'll show stuff like that, but rockets? I do not think they told us about these rockets. Okay, so first, the Star-Spangled Banner is the national anthem of the United States. The lyrics come from the defense of Fort McHenry, a poem written on September 14th, 1814 by a 35-year-old lawyer and amateur poet, Francis Scott Key, after he witnessed the bombardment of Fort McHenry by British ships, and this was of the Royal Navy, so, you know, very powerful. We know the British had the most powerful navy in the world, so probably had the best technology as well. So this happened in the Baltimore Harbor during the War of 1812. Also, I noticed that this bombing happened to take place on September 13th. So it was a 25-hour barrage of Congreve rockets fired from British ship Erebus, if I'm pronouncing that right. So the Erebus ship carried 20 Congreve rocket batteries, consisting of a box housing multiple metal firing tubes. So each of these rockets weighed about 30 pounds and carried an incendiary charge. Incendiary, it's like fire, you know, it makes things go into flames, if my Call of Duty knowledge is correct. So, a number of American ships were destroyed, obviously, but there were just 4 deaths and minimal damage reported to the Fort McHenry. Okay, so now we can go over a brief history of rockets. So the first gunpowder rockets happened to be invented or evolved in medieval China under the Song dynasty in the 13th century. The Mongols later adopted the Chinese rocket technology, and the invention spread via the Mongol invasions to the Middle East and Europe. And this was in the 13th century. So internal combustion rocket propulsion is mentioned in a reference in 1264, recording that the ground rat a type of firework, had frightened the Empress Mother Gongsheng at a feast held in her honor by her son Emperor Lizong. Probably pronouncing these names wrong, but it's not very important to the subject anyway. Subsequently, rockets are included in the military treaties. I don't know what the hell this word means. Okay, also known as the Fire Drake Manual, written by the Chinese artillery officer Zhao Yu in the mid-14th century. This text mentions the first multi-stage rocket, thought to have been used by the Chinese Navy. Medieval and early modern rockets were used militarily as incendiary weapons in fire sieges between 1270 and 1280. And this was written by Hassan al-Ramah, who wrote the book of military horsemanship and ingenious war devices. This book included 107 gunpowder recipes, 22 of them used for rockets. And in Europe, Conrad Kaiser described rockets in his military at Belli Fortis around the year 1405. So rockets had apparently been around, but of course, nobody's going to teach us this in school. Okay, thankfully we're done talking about old Chinese rockets. Now we can go to our time frame of interest here, around 1775 to 1870. So let's start with first the Mysorean rockets. These were first successful iron-cased rockets. They were developed in the 18th century in the kingdom of Mysore. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. Hopefully I am. And then the second is the Congreve rocket, which we also already talked about, which is the rocket that was discussed with the Rockets Red Glare in the national anthem. Okay, so together, the Mysorean and British innovations increased the effective range of military rockets from 100 to 2,000 yards. So that is a drastic increase. The first mathematical treatment of dynamic rocket propulsion is due to William Moore, year 1813. And then in 1815, Alexander Dmitrievich Zazyadako constructed rocket launching platforms which allowed rockets to be fired in salvos, which is 6 rockets at a time. So 6 rockets at a time in 1815, guys. So we've definitely been lied to, it seems. And third, William Hale, 1844, greatly increased the accuracy of rocket artillery. And then again in 1865, Edward Boxer improved the rocket even further. And then in the Civil War, apparently there were bazookas. So, very crazy stuff, guys. And so it appears that the Mysorean rockets were an Indian military weapon, East India to be specific. And these rockets happened to be used against the British Empire. We know the British Empire was in India because of the British East India Company. Why were they there? Were they there for that rocket technology? Is that the truth that we were not told? I don't know, guys. I'm just trying to connect dots here. Rockets could be of various sizes, usually consisted of a tube of soft hammered iron about 8 inches long and 1.5 to 3 inches in diameter. Okay, so these things could go almost 1,000 yards. So I guess the British boosted that another 1,000 yards, so their rocket happened to be double the Indian rocket. So you can see where they got that technology from, though. And they just kept building upon it. I could keep talking about rockets, but quite frankly, I've already spent more time than I intended to, and I think it's time to move on to a different subject. So we shall move on. Okay, now we can talk about cymatics, however it's pronounced, and resonant frequencies within churches or cathedrals, whatever you want to call them. So if you look at this picture, you can see that we have 4, sorry, I wasn't looking at the picture, 4 churches here. And under it you see 4 circles. Those circles are the resonant frequencies. They were translated by a woman who went and she recorded the sounds, and then you can use water. I'll show a video of this at some point. And yeah, so you can convert it basically so the water makes these shapes when you play the frequencies that these churches, as they were called, produced. I mean, I personally don't think there were churches or cathedrals at all. I think it was some sort of power plant, but so it produced those things, and also the stained glass windows. Like a lot of these churches have circular stained glass windows, and guess what shape they happen to be in? The resonant frequency within.